All right, thank you. I wanted to provide an update. Since our levy failure on November 5th, our team has been busy working. We've worked with our administrative team to eliminate $4.8 million from our budgets for this current year, and then looking ways to sustain and/or increase that as we move forward into future years. So I just want to share what some of those items are that we pulled out of the budgets this year. We looked at some of the contracted services or repairs that typically are in our general fund. We are postponing a K-5 math curriculum adoption and using our current materials, along with our special education math curriculum adoption. We are reducing professional development opportunities, reducing purchases of other instructional materials and supplies, such as textbooks, magazines, et cetera, for media centers. We are reducing the amount of instructional software that we have available. We have some unfilled school resource officer positions that the police department hasn't been able to fill yet, that we are going to not fill for the remainder of this year, and then we'll want to have some dialogue about whether or not we would want to fill them moving forward as we look at future rounds here. We're looking at other non-instructional materials and supplies. So we have been under budget for fuel, so we were able to reduce that line. We're able to defer replacement of our access control cards that we had planned to replace, those types of materials. We have other, I mentioned some of the professional technical services, so looking at like design services for projects, making sure that all those are coming out of our permanent improvement fund versus a general fund, looking at software like Cronus that we use with our routing software for our buses, moving that out, postponing, replacing some of that. And some additional work that we have been doing with aligning our policies with Ohio Revised Code and looking at some of the contracted services around helping us align that, reducing those services. Not purchasing as many of our technology devices as we had planned, and then postponing replacement of audiovisual equipment in the schools. So those were some of the areas that, and again, I would just say with the timing of the year, there were some things that had already been spent that as we look at moving forward, those may be different savings that we're able to actualize as we go into those other school years. And I'll pause there to see if you have any questions on that.
Go ahead. Just to be clear, so some of those are reductions in spending that are likely to be able to be carried forward, and some of them are really delaying.
Correct.
Right? So
Yep.
they will have to come up at some point.
Yes. So for example, the math curriculum, we think we can wait until 2031 for the elementary math curriculum. At that point, the current edition that we're using would be out of print, so the subscriptions and software for that we wouldn't be able to continue to support. And I think with the caveat too, as we look especially at our curricular materials, that everything we're deciding obviously is always based on the information we have at the time, and we know that things change quite frequently. So for example, we've talked multiple times in here about the science of reading requirements for our literacy materials. So the state has required that we have certain materials that meet the requirements on a list of approved vendors that can provide materials for science of reading instruction. Our K2 materials are already in compliance. Our 3-5 ones are not, so we do need to move forward with that purchase. But the math as of now is not a requirement. Now that could be something next year. They could come in with a requirement that whatever we have in math doesn't meet some type of requirement. So that is always, everything we do obviously is always, at the mercy of legislative changes or other requirements that we have. So based on the information we have now, we're still working through and looking at, what else can we, so if some of those things we're able to put out of this 5-year forecast and use what we have. Typically, we have a cycle where we evaluate how materials are doing and look, if there's something that we think would be better. But unless the standards are changing, we're looking at can we use those longer and kind of push those cycles out a little bit as an example.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. That was yours too? Okay. Any other questions?
Well, Just is it correct then that even if we are required by the General Assembly to change some of our, our curriculum, we aren't given additional funding to be able to do that? We have to use our own funding to be able to change that curriculum to come in alignment with the law.
That's typically the case, and I think I might have said that backwards. So just to clarify, our K2 is what needs replaced. Our 3.5 is currently okay. I think I might have said that backwards. So just to clarify that. So we did get some money, for example, when the state, and I think we've mentioned this before, but just to remind folks, when the state came out with the science of reading requirements, we did get some money as a pass-through to pay stipends to our teachers for mandatory training that they have to do, but that was not to cover the actual materials themselves. So we did see money to help with that requirement. We are required to pay, all teachers have to have that training, some level of it depending on what they teach. And so we did get stipends, but the materials themselves we are required to pay for. And I would anticipate if there are other, like a math change would probably be similar.
Yeah, I just want to mention, as the state moves things around, they're just continuing to decrease our funding instead of giving us additional funds pretty much every step of the way, so.
And I know Nicole did a nice job with the 5-year forecast of pointing that out, but there's an example where if you look, it looks like we got a little more than they initially said in our state funding, but in a restricted funding, but it was actually the pass-through of those stipends for the teachers. So it didn't give us any additional funding we could use toward actually implementing that.
I just want to highlight that this is just the beginning, make sure people understand that this is just the start.
Yep, so that's a good segue. Just to kind of give an update, so we talked at the last meeting about looking at some tier 1 reductions, which would be things that we would recommend with most of those items, looking at being ongoing items. And so we are working with our team to look at ways that we can reduce and restructure our district level positions, including our administration. We have 2 negotiations this year with 2 of our associations, WA and WESA, and then we also have our admin wage and benefit guidelines, so starting to work on those. Already talked about the budget reductions, which includes, as I mentioned, subscriptions, technology, deferring purchases, et cetera. We are looking at what would be the impact if we would minimally in this tier 1 increase any type of fees that we have. So those would potentially could be pay to participate, course fees, or general fees. So getting that information together to share with the board for a discussion. We've already recommended, and Nicole's already looked at doing, eliminating our turf fund transfer. So in the past, we have turf at our 3 high schools, so we had put $65,000 a year, so that could build up. So looking at taking all that out of permanent improvement funds. Also looking at, what are the other items that we're able to move to our permanent improvement fund and take out of the general fund. So we have things like bus purchases, technology purchases, and obviously then as we look at our roof replacement, our HVAC and those types of expenses, definitely reduces what we're able to do in terms of those projects, in terms of what's left. Looking at reducing some staff in this round, including through attrition, which would have some impact on core instruction, student choice, and student supports, limited at that tier 1 level. Looking at potentially reducing the scope for summer learning academy. So right now we're looking at, what are we required to do? We have to do the preschool component because we are required to start educating our preschoolers when they turn 3. And so that includes if they turn 3 in the summer. So we've been able to meet that requirement through our summer programming. Also looking at some of our courses that have fees. So that will be something that we'll bring as a topic of conversation. Looking at reducing some of our supplemental offerings. So we have a lot of different clubs and activities. So looking at putting together the numbers of what those different offerings cost. Continuing to review our transportation for efficiencies. So I will tell you, right now we're already down 7 to 9 bus drivers from the time the day starts, just because of shortages where we can't fill positions and some people being out on leaves. So when we look at routing differently, it would be more us being able to staff everything, but then also not needing as many routes. If we don't need as many routes, we don't need to replace as many buses. Buses are over 150,000 apiece now, the maintenance on those, it's more of that type of expense that we would be able to save out of the general fund. And then, as we mentioned before, we are examining pretty much every facet of the organization, so I'm sure there are other things that don't fit into those general categories as we kind of work through. So we're planning on making a recommendation that we move the organizational meeting up. We've talked to somebody about this, but just to let folks know. Move the organizational meeting up to January 6th, have some of our regular agenda items on there, which would open up then the 13th for us to be able to have a more in-depth conversation. With the holidays in there, just need a little extra time to pull some of that information together so that we can have some good dialogue. Any questions on that or anything any additional information at this point that would be helpful? Okay, so again, we'll be working on that and we'll plan on having some conversation in January. Thank you.